I have a paper that is really atypical for me. I decided that listening to a talk that Esther Adnow gave a long time ago, decided to do a deep dive into sort of the theoretical background for in the social psychological research that she was doing and bringing that into conversation with oracles. So this paper stems out of that deep dive. So it's sort of Herodotus light, but hopefully I can indicate that there are good things that come out of this and good implications for how we should be understanding Herodotus maybe in a different way. So scholars in classics are comfortable, and too comfortable, I think, in their thinking that prophecies sometimes do not come true. Pierre Bonnechère expresses the common reasoning well, saying, quote, as for erroneous predictions, unless one actually believes in Apollo, one must admit a real percentage of error. Since no intellectually respectable one actually believes in Apollo, let alone the rest of the Greek pantheon, this much seems common sense. The fascinating questions for moderns, then, is how belief in oracular prophecy could have been maintained in communities that must have experienced the disappointing effects of this real percentage of error. Most studies on the subject of failed prophecy are devoted to parsing and understanding the various types of bad thinking by which the Greeks reconciled this basic reality to their belief. In instances where the oracles were falsified, they have pointed out that consultants may have come to believe that they had misinterpreted them. Oracles could, after all, appear vague or on closer inspection only seem to approve an action as opposed to promising success. Some vague oracles seemed to be ambiguous, and so they could be reinterpreted as being fulfilled in unanticipated outcomes. Others were not so specific as to indicate a particular time for success, and so consultants could continue expecting fulfillment later. Variations in divinatory abilities and malfeasance on the part of priests and priestesses, as well as delegates, could also be called upon to excuse erroneous predictions. The consensus, though, is that these explanations amount to strategies or loopholes to explain away the inaccuracies and thus allow people to continue believing in their demonstrably false prophecies. Thomas Harrison puts the case. It is important to emphasize that the various turns of argument by which belief in the fulfillment of oracles and other forms of divination is maintained do not constitute a consciously developed system, but rather a set of ad hoc strategies for answering the questions that a belief in divination inevitably threw up. Divination, in the words of Liebeschietz, was, quote, to a considerable extent, protected by the vagueness of its theoretical principles, end quote. Any attempt to excavate the network of such principles will tend to lend them an artificial artificial impression of coherence. The idea here is that an unsystematic and largely unconscious set of rationalizations was always at hand for believers to insulate their belief in the power of divination from empirical refutation. Esther Adnow's recent study has proposed the need for more nuance and challenged us to see not to see structural blocks of falsification here, these, citing John Skorupski, or ways in which facts and theories lose their potential for coming into direct opposition, but rather to see the effects of individual and social cognitive processes. However, the pervasive and persuasive assumption in all of these studies on the subject is that there are such clearly identifiable and inevitable contradictions between prophecies and reality that one may speak of objective non-fulfillment, failure, or disconfirmation. The objectivity of these modern observations has been set opposed to the subjectivity of ancient beliefs. And while those beliefs are made understandable to modern minds in this way, they are, often incidentally, rendered stupid, irrational, or just plain wrong. To be sure, these studies have added significantly to our knowledge of divination in the ancient world, but it is worth interrogating this modern sense of objectivity. The modern notion that prophecy can fail is fundamentally at odds with the ancients who believed that their prophecies were true, even where modern researchers have insisted that they have actually failed. Clearly, then, the ancients were not thinking with modern minds, but examining how they found their oracles to be true adds to our knowledge of what prophecy was to the people who believed it. In this paper, I argue that recent scholarship on ancient oracles collapses a meaningful distinction between a belief in prophecy and a belief in an interpretation of prophecy. It is an illusion that is borrowed from research on prophetic disconfirmation in the field of social psychology and has important consequences for interpretation when applied to the ancient evidence. By analyzing the pertinent studies in social psychology, I show that this research often contains a tacit assumption that prophecy is only interpreted correctly when it is done literally and conventionally as bearing upon observable phenomena. While it is a valid edict way to assess prophetic beliefs, the evidence indicates that believers in prophecy possess a more ranging hermeneutic and trust in the reality of unobservable phenomena. Thus, they often come to think that their prophecies were fulfilled, might still be fulfilled, or could have been fulfilled under different circumstances. For this reason, I suggest that a more emic perspective on the issue of prophetic fulfillment offers another way to understand the evidence that will illuminate what oracles and prophecies are to those who believe in them, and in what ways they may be considered true. By comparing stories from new religious and millennial movements to oracular tales from Herodotus Histories, I illustrate three types of belief in prophetic truth: truth and fulfillment, truth and expectation, and conditional truth. The basic consonants and beliefs about prophetic truth between the modern world and the world of the histories assures us that Herodotus' depiction is a realistic one. More than that, the different types of truth that believers locate in prophecy proves that a prophetic sign is a very different thing from an interpretation of the prophetic sign. Interest in failed prophecy is rarely found outside of the realm of social psychology. It was in this field that Leon Festinger, Henry W. Recken, and Stanley Schachter were working when they wrote When Prophecy Fails in 1956. In this classic book, the researchers for the first time laid out the theory of cognitive dissonance to test their hypotheses about what believers do when their prophecies are disconfirmed. Basically, their theory holds that there exists a tension between cognitions and reality. When a person experiences stress because of a disjuncture between the two, that is to say, cognitive dissonance, that person will seek to reduce the disparity in some way and bring them back into tolerable tension. Using this theory, they sought to explain their observations about some historical examples of prophetic movements: early Christianity, Montanism, Sabbatai Zevi, and the Millerites. As they understood matters, there is a paradox in the survival of these groups after the objective disconfirmation of their prophecies. Believers did not simply discard their beliefs as was expected. Instead, they eliminated dissonance by ignoring challenging aspects of reality, or reduced the dissonance by revising their beliefs in prophecy with rationalizations, that is to say, explanations, revisions, or reinterpretations, or by proselyting, that is, persuading others of the validity of their beliefs. Determining the conditions under which proselyting would be a predictable response to disconfirmed prophecy was the central focus of When Prophecy Fails. The authors argued that it could be expected under 5 conditions. 1, the belief is deeply held and relevant to behavior. 2, the person holding the belief is committed to it by important actions that are difficult to undo. 3, the belief must be specific enough that events can prove the belief unequivocally false. 4, undeniable evidence of disconfirmation must be identifiable and perceived by the believer. And 5, the believer has social support from other believers. They tested their hypothesis by infiltrating a group that has been called the Seekers. This group believed, among other things, that Marion Keech of Lake City, really Dorothy Martin of Chicago, was contacted by extraterrestrial beings of a higher spiritual power called the Guardians. One of the Guardians, named Sananda, who was a manifestation of Jesus Christ and Marion Keech's main contact, communicated that on December 21st, 1954, there was going to be a great flood that would destroy much of the Western Hemisphere. Additionally, she was informed that the members of the group were to be rescued from the cataclysm by spacemen and flying saucers. The prophecy seemed very specific, and the most devoted members believed ardently enough in it that they quit their jobs and took other significant measures. To make a long story short, the winter solstice came and went. When no deluge happened, the group, which had been very reluctant to share their beliefs with outsiders, began a flurry of public activity and used the media attention that they had received to claim, by way of another message from Sananda, that the light of their vigil had spread broadly enough to spare the planet its once impending doom. If their theory was correct, the researchers had witnessed firsthand how a group dealt with extreme cognitive dissonance, and their predicted increase in proselytism was confirmed. Subsequent experimental studies in social psychology have generally supported the fundamentals of cognitive dissonance theory, though not without some controversy. Outside the laboratory, however, social psychologists did not find the same results among new religious and millennial movements with prophetic beliefs as Festinger, Reichen, and Schachter did among the seekers. The problem that they discovered was not that cognitive dissonance was a completely useless concept. Rather, they came to think that Festinger, Reichen, and Schachter had placed too much importance on proselyting as a reaction to prophetic disconfirmation, and that the researchers had been overly confident in their ability to identify objectively the moment at which cognitive dissonance would be experienced. Later studies on new religious and millennial movements showed that proselyting was not a predictable or even common reaction to disconfirmation of prophecy, even under the conditions that when prophecy fails had specified. The lack of predictive power in these conditions prompted researchers to investigate other kinds of reactions and to interrogate the social dynamics and thought worlds in these groups to account for their survival. There is now, for example, broad agreement that timely internal social support provided both by leadership and by other members is vital. Some, on the other hand, emphasize the robustness of the group's existing doctrine, worship, and ethics, and have pointed out that these groups believe far more than just a set of prophecies. In-group worldviews may come fortified not only with other beliefs and practices that can be re-emphasized after disconfirmation, but even with complex symbolic and reasoning systems that can be called upon to rationalize, there's the word again, prophetic failure. By concerning themselves with what and how these groups think, researchers have demonstrated in many instances that believers appear not to recognize the disconfirmation that social psychologists do. And in some instances, they actually come to believe their prophecies to have been fulfilled. This difference between the emic perspective of groups that believe in prophecy and the edic perspective of researchers have had important and underappreciated consequences. A close look at Joseph Sigmund's analysis of prophecy among the Jehovah's Witnesses indicates two key factors in considering the problem of prophetic failure. Quote, first, the prophecies were phrased in a manner that made them only partially open to disconfirmation. As already indicated, they were derived from the broader belief system and had both supernatural and empirical reference. Insofar as they pertained to prospective events of a supernatural character, the group's faith in its own belief system provided a basis for the claim of fulfillment, and the selective perception of objective events under the influence of the belief system furnished the support of empirical evidence. In this sense and to this extent, the prophecies could not fail. End quote. There are then two important considerations when dealing with prophecy from the point of view of modern social psychology. The first is the qualities of the prophecy itself, and the second is the belief system that maintains prophecy and makes it intelligible among believers. The first consideration, the qualities of the prophecy, impinges on the third criterion of Festinger, Reichen, and Schachter. The prophecy must be specific enough that it may be said to have been objectively disconfirmed. As some scholars have pointed out, though, Prophecies can be vague and ambiguous enough that reinterpretation in the case of prophetic failure is always possible. The problem of prophetic vagueness and ambiguity, though, is far more extensive than current studies have appreciated. Robert Carroll, for example, provides an example of a statement that he believes to be easily verified or falsified. It will rain tomorrow. Obviously, if we are to take its meaning conventionally and literally, the statement will only be true if one goes outside tomorrow and experiences the familiar effects of a rainstorm. However, nothing compels us to understand the meaning of the prediction either conventionally or literally. Much depends on the meaning of the verb rain. The claim could be considered predictive under the circumstances of local atmospheric precipitation, naturally falling water, driving through a car wash, artificially falling water, or even making it rain at the club, a trope. There is also the problem that rain is not so specific as to determine a quantity. So even if understood literally and as indicating a natural phenomenon, both a gentle mist and a genuine Baptist downpour might be said to fulfill the prediction. Further, it is only by convention that we may understand the prediction to pertain to any specific location or time. We may suppose that the prediction pertains to the location of the speaker and to the day after the prediction was made. But since this prediction is, in fact, written in a book, we could believe that the prediction pertains to wherever the author lived and whenever he wrote the words, or wherever we are and whenever we read them. So hermeneutical experimentation with this example illustrates that language is an imperfect and inexact tool. The imprecision means, and this is key, that crafting an objectively falsifiable prediction is impossible without a convention of understanding that allows it to be objectively falsified. This more realistic appreciation of language directly challenges the presumed objectivity claimed in modern studies of what is called failed prophecy. Now, an objection might be raised that statements or notions do not exist apart from an individual that expresses or thinks them. Put another way, a thought does not exist apart from a mind that thinks the thought. For this reason, one might suppose that the meaning of a thought, like a truth, is understood to that individual absent the conventions of interpersonal communication, like words, required for another individual to understand it. And even if that were true, and I don't think it is, this objection does not altogether bypass the requirement that there be a way in which the thought is true, like correspondence, pragmatism, or relativism. Otherwise, one would have no way of explaining how it is true in the way that the one thinking it considers it to be true when that individual identifies it as a true thing. If a statement or thought is true, it must be understood as being true in a particular way. On the other side of the issue, in-group belief systems, it makes sense that believers in prophecy would also have broader systems of interpretation that can make their prophecies intelligible. In other words, the people to whom the prophecies are meaningful in the first place tend to have the means to discover that meaning even in changed circumstances. Scholarship on new religious and millennial movements has often referred to this kind of thinking somewhat pejoratively as rationalizations, face-saving strategies, or cognitive errors, and has created a typology to differentiate them. Thus, when faced with an event that cannot literally and conventionally confirm their expectations for the prophecy, some groups come to believe that the expected event really did happen in an unexpected way at a different level of reality. They call it spiritualization. Believers may also suppose that they have simply misinterpreted the message from beyond or made a miscalculation relating to that message. That's called a human error. Sometimes they come to believe that the would-be agents of the expected event decided not to act after all. That's a test of faith. Other times, groups may possess an idiosyncratic system of thought that appears to insulate their prophecies from failure altogether. What comes into focus is a classic problem of emic and edict definitions. While some researchers observe and study what they typically call oracular failure or prophetic failure, members of new religious and millennial movements continue to believe that their prophecies have been fulfilled, could have been fulfilled if the right conditions had been met, or are still waiting for fulfillment. For them, their prophecies are messages that contain something true, even if that truth is unexpected, difficult to interpret, or conditional. As I have argued, prophecies, like all claims, are never falsifiable in the strictest sense of the term, apart from a specific interpretation that makes them meaningful, and then therefore subject to falsification. Further, researchers have shown that those who believe in prophecies use a much broader hermeneutic system than modern researchers do in understanding that prophetic meaning. The objectivist and edict perspective of researchers has therefore only grasped one side of a two-sided problem. The current focus in scholarship, both in social psychology and classics, has been on using a notion of prophetic failure to understand how groups can continue to believe in prophecy. I propose to use how groups continue to believe in prophecy to develop a better understanding of what prophecy is among believers. Adopting this emic perspective, in addition, will give us a more complete understanding of the phenomenon. Among believers, prophecy appears to be thought of as true by its nature. False prophecy, therefore, is effectively not prophecy at all. We can observe this from how groups of believers deal with prophecy. This truth comes in different forms, and I distinguish three types, though not necessarily exhaustive. Truth and fulfillment, dealing with past things. Truth and expectation, dealing with future things. And conditional truth. Truth and fulfillment is what group members come to believe when a prophecy seems to them to map onto a perceived reality. Typically, this kind of truth is understood from an unexpected interpretation of a prophecy. The story of the Shrine of Fundamental Truth is an excellent example of a group who discovers this kind of truth. The leader of this group received a series of messages from the Holy Spirit that indicated a great earthquake would happen before or after 8 a.m. on June 18, 1974. Naturally, believers took the precautions that would be expected of people who had understood the prophecy literally and conventionally: pamphleteering, stockpiling of supplies, and selling off possessions that were expected to be lost. No earthquake happened on the predicted day, but active members in the group at the time of the researchers' reporting believed that God had brought the earthquake to bear on their leader's body. The leader had, in fact, attempted suicide sometime shortly after 8 a.m. that day by cutting his abdomen. The leader explained that as he lay dying before the altar, I thought that I had finally managed to get out of my body at last, and I was greatly surprised to find that my body had changed itself into the islands of Japan, and that a fire had broken out at its center. Then I knew that God had transferred the cataclysm to my own body. Obviously, this interpretation of the prophecy is very different from the one that the group believed at first. Nevertheless, this reinterpretation was done to recognize the truth that the prophecy bore by unexpectedly prefiguring the suicide attempt as the fulfillment of the predicted cataclysm. In Herodotus, truth and fulfillment is found in nearly all his stories about oracles. While some oracles are fulfilled in the way that consultants anticipate, interpretation can become complicated and more creative when encountering unanticipated outcomes. The most familiar example comes from the story of Croesus's oracles about ending a great empire. Thinking that these oracles predicted the fall of the Persian Empire, he attacked. In the end, though, he fulfilled the oracles by destroying his own great empire. Similarly, when the Spartans asked the Delphic oracle for Arcadia, the Pythia said that they would measure out a beautiful plain with a cord. Believing that Delphi prophesied their victory, the Spartans went into battle with chains to enslave the Tegeans. However, they lost the battle and ended up measuring out the plain with the Tegeans with a cord as slaves working their land. Finally, the Delphic oracle once told Cleomenes that he would capture Argos. He launched an expedition against the Argives, but when he learned that he had burned a grove sacred to Argus the hero, the king understood that the oracle had been fulfilled, saying, "Oracular Apollo, you have deceived me greatly indeed, saying that I would destroy Argos. I conjecture that my oracle is fulfilled. He therefore marched his army back to Sparta. At risk of running roughshod over the narrative complexities here, consultants in all of these stories and the historian discover a truth in the oracles that was unexpected when they first interpreted them. Nevertheless, the truth of each oracle is confirmed by how their words correspond to the consultant's experience of events. Truth in expectation is identifiable when believers' hopes for fulfillment go unmet and are postponed, but remain largely unchanged. Usually, the postponement of prophetic expectation is deemed necessary because of human error, that is, a misinterpretation or a miscalculation of some kind. A group called the Church of the True Word provides an example of what I am calling truth in expectation. Using the book of Revelation prophetically, they believed that a third of the population of the planet would be wiped out in a nuclear holocaust. In anticipation, many believers left their jobs and homes, built bomb shelters, and stockpiled resources to survive the disaster. On July 4th, 1960, a prophet received the message, "The Egyptians are coming, get ye to the safe places." The believers descended into the shelters and stayed there for 42 days. When they emerged into a largely unchanged world, they celebrated their fellowship and the strengthening of their faith. The group later explained that they had misunderstood the prophecy. Jane Hardick and Marcia Braden recall, quote, "They had discovered by looking back over all of their messages that it had never been stated that the attack was imminent. They had simply misunderstood God's purposes. Really, God had just been using them to warn a world that was asleep, while at the same time he was testing their faith. They had passed the test and thus proved themselves even more worthy to be among God's elect." We further discovered that they all continued to believe that an attack would come soon. Thus, when the expected event did not happen, the groups continued to believe that their literal and conventional expectations from the prophecy would be met at some later point in time. In their eyes, the only problem was that they had assumed more about the timing of the nuclear holocaust than the prophecy seemed to support. This view of prophetic truth is also found in Herodotus' oracular tales. For example, when the Thebans were seeking revenge against the Athenians, the Delphic oracle told them that their revenge would not come from themselves, and to ask their nearest. After conjecturing that Apollo meant the Aeginetans as their nearest, the Thebans asked them for help and were given the sacred images of the Aeacidae. They took these images as their allies into battle with the Athenians, obviously expecting that the Aeacidae would exact revenge for them, but they lost the battle. Disappointed in their belief, the Thebans returned the Aeacidae and asked the Aeginetans for men instead. This decision subtly indicates an acknowledgement that they had misinterpreted the oracle. Although the Thebans persisted in believing that they were told to ask the Aeginetans, they determined another way that the Aeginetans would help avenge them, by attacking the Athenians while they were engaged elsewhere against the Thebans. Their insistence that this oracle indicated truth prompted the Thebans to reinterpret the oracle in such a way that they could continue expecting the fulfillment of their promised revenge. Finally, there is the conditional type of prophetic truth. Believers locate this kind of truth in prophecies that are thought to have been true at the moment of their reception, but their lack of fulfillment is later an acknowledged fact. Sometimes prophecies are contingent upon the will of the divine, the supernatural, or superhuman beings who transmit them and are responsible for bringing them to fulfillment. Naturally, the more competition there is between the interests of these higher powers, and the greater the difference between their powers and any resisting forces, the more likely a prophecy will have only conditional truth. The leader of the Pana Wave Laboratory, Yuko Chino, provides an excellent example of this kind of prophetic truth. She claimed to have received several prophecies from extraterrestrials. The first was that the close proximity of the planet Nibiru to Earth on May 15, 2003, would cause a shift in the magnetic poles that would trigger massive earthquakes and tsunamis. No such thing happened that day. Jimenez Murguia records though that members began to rationalize the prophecy. In their understanding, they had been given a divine reprieve. The date had been changed because, as one believer put it, quote, "The gods and our chairman did not wish for the end of the world." The part of the thinking here that I want to draw attention to is the belief that the prophecy would have been fulfilled at the time and in the way it was expected, but the beings with the power to make it happen were reluctant to act. In another set of prophecies, Ugochino set the new date for the spring of 2005 and prophesied that the flying saucers would arrive beforehand to rescue believers. On December 13th, 2004, however, another memorandum was issued stating that, quote, "All 21 units of the UFO fleet have crashed into the sea as a result of shortage of food and fuel." This time, believers came to think that the extraterrestrials had the will and even attempted to save them, as they said they would in the prophecy. The problem was that they were poorly supplied with the provisions necessary to accomplish the task, and, being subject to such failures, perished. The situation with the ill-fated fleet of flying saucers recalls the Pythia's defense of Apollo to Croesus. The Lydian king complained that Apollo had deceived him despite being the beneficiary of his own extravagant gifts. The Pythia responded, "It is impossible to avoid the allotted fate, even for a god. Croesus paid for the error of his fifth-generation ancestor, who, as a spearman, obedient to a woman's plot, murdered his master and held the man's office, even though it did not in any way belong to him." Although Loxias desired that the suffering of Sardis happen in the time of his children and not that of Croesus himself, he was not able to bypass the fates. But however much they conceded, he accomplished and granted to him. For he postponed the sack of Sardis for 3 years. And let Croesus know this, that it was sacked 3 years later than it was allotted. The thinking about the gods represented here is reminiscent of that found in the Panawave laboratory group about extraterrestrials. Ultimately, Apollo did not have the power to override the fates, only to defer what was fated. This admission, of course, raises the possibility that the gods could promise to help a consultant, but be prevented from doing so by more powerful forces. Thus, an oracular prophecy might only be true conditionally, more powerful forces notwithstanding. Although this might seem to be an unsatisfactory excuse for moderns, comparison with the Panawave laboratory suggests that believers can discover this kind of truth and think it reasonable. Sometimes in Herodotus, the conditional nature of the prophecy is made explicit in the wording of the oracle. When the Athenians sought revenge against the Aeginetans for their unheralded war, the Pythia told them that, having kept away from the injustice of the Aeginetans for 30 years, in the 31st year, and after assigning a sanctuary for Iacchus, they should begin the war against the Aeginetans, and that their wishes will come true. But if they should attack presently, that they will, on the one hand, suffer many things in the intervening time, and will, on the other hand, accomplish many things, and will subjugate them in the end. The Athenians, then, appear to have had a choice about what to do. At first, the Athenians attempted to bide their time patiently, but before the 30 years were over, they could hold off no longer. When they launched their attack, they fulfilled the second part of the oracle and could look forward to accomplishing and suffering much in the Persian wars that followed. In light of this fulfillment, the first part of the oracle could come to be understood as possessing a conditional truth, the fulfillment of which was apparently subject to a free choice. In other stories, consultants appear to hope, usually in vain, for this sort of prophetic truth when they seek to avoid the negative outcomes that their oracles predict. Arcesilaus tries to avoid his predicted death by staying away from Cyrene, which is Sigurd. Triton told the Argonauts that when one of their descendants should take possession of his tripod, the Greeks would need to establish 100 cities around his lake. Thus, the native Libyans hid the tripod from being rediscovered. The Spartans meddle in Athenian affairs on 2 separate occasions to avoid fulfilling oracles predicting their suffering from growing Athenian power. Although Herodotus does not seem to endorse the notion that genuine oracles could be without any kind of truth, his editorializing can give a sense that the worst kinds of fulfillment might have been avoided. He claims that both Arcesilaus, in the case above, and Croesus, in dealing with his great empire, missed the point of the oracles. Also, Herodotus's note that Polycrates ignored all foreboding oracles and a dream prior to his trip to Magnesia suggests that he might have taken their advice and avoided his brutal death there. Elsewhere, he explains that the Euboeans had an oracle of Bacchus that told them to, quote, be careful whenever the barbarian tongue should throw a papyrus yoke into the sea to keep the much bleeding goats away from Euboea. The oracle was fulfilled in Croesus's bridging of the Hellespont and Themistocles' mass slaughter of their flocks. However, Herodotus adds, quote, being unready to pay attention to those words that were declared, they were ready all the more to pay attention to their misfortune, both in their present ills and the ones to come. By blaming the Euboeans for their own misfortune, the implication seems to be that this specific outcome might have been avoidable. For example, the Euboeans might have fulfilled the oracle differently by removing their animals to safety. In such a case, this oracle would possess a sort of conditional truth. If you do not move your flocks from Euboea, they will all die. In the end, though, Herodotus indicates that the type of prophetic truth found in these oracles was understood in real, not hypothetical moments of fulfillment. A lost kingdom, death, expanding Athenian power, and the slaughter of livestock. We may observe from these examples that prophetic truth is thought to be a constant, even though believers change their understanding of it according to their experiences. In the end, believers may hold that their prophecies either are true in an originally unexpected way, will be true in the expected way at a later point in time, or would have been true if other factors had not intervened. There is then an important and rarely noticed distinction to be made between a prophecy and an expectation framed by an interpretation of prophecy. It is not the prophecy that is falsified, nor for this reason can we speak of prophetic failure. Rather, it is always a specific expectation framed by a particular interpretation, usually literal and conventional, that even believers will agree to have been disconfirmed under certain circumstances. The history of the Millerites, used by Festinger, Recken, and Schachter in When Prophecy Fails, can clarify this point. After some years of studying the Bible, William Miller predicted that Jesus Christ's second coming would occur in the year 1843. This prediction, however, was an interpretation of a number of passages from the Bible that he believed to be prophetic. The second coming of Christ is prophesied in Acts 1:11, among others, but he calculated the year 1843 from the 2,300 days of cleansing in the sanctuary mentioned in Daniel 8:14. Interpreting prophetic days to mean secular years, he simply added 2,300 years to the supposed time of the prophecy in 457 BC. It may be fair to offer that the events of 1843 through 4, sometimes called the Great Disappointment, apparently disconfirmed Miller's original interpretation. There is, however, no sense in which the events of those years may be said to have disconfirmed either the prophecy of Christ's return in Acts 1:11, famously open-ended as this prophecy is, or the prophetic value of Daniel 8:14. All that may be said is that neither of these passages seem to have meant exactly what Miller thought they did. There is therefore an important difference between a prophetic sign, whether a divinely inspired word or interplanetary communication, and an interpretation, a claim about the meaning of a prophetic sign that gives framework to an expectation, guides action, and becomes falsifiable. This distinction is not observed in studies of prophecy within social psychology, which approaches it from the perspective of prophetic failure. So when scholars and classics adopted the same perspective after being inspired by these studies, they similarly could not observe this meaningful distinction. The effects of this can be observed in how some scholars have discussed the example of Darius's expedition to Sicily. For background, Darius desired to found a Spartan colony. Antichares of Eleon told him that he should found one in Sicily. He explained this thought by citing an oracle of Laius that named Heraclean land in Sicily, claiming therefore that, quote, all the land of Eryx belonged to the Heraclidae, since Heracles himself came into possession of it. Then Darius went to Delphi and asked the oracle whether he will take the land to which he heads. And the Pythia is made to state simply and with a single word that he will take it. Thomas Harrison has summarized the episode, saying, quote, Darius, for example, on consulting Delphi as to whether he should take a colony to Eryx, a plan inspired by some prophecies of Laius, is simply told that he should. Similarly, Lisa Maurizio says, when Darius, the younger brother of Cleomenes, leaves Sparta, he receives advice from Antichares of Eleon to take Eryx, the region in western Sicily that belonged to Heracles and thus to Darius' descendant. Darius consults with Delphi and is told to take it. In both their representations of the story, the Pythia's oracle is understood to reflect Darius' intent in asking the question, and exactly the meaning he took when he continued on to Sicily after going first to Italy. Even in Esther Idenau's otherwise carefully worded abridgment of Darius' question and the Pythia's response, she nevertheless aligns the oracle with Darius' intent in a slightly different way, saying, quote, Darius identifies the territory to which he is preparing to go. The priestess responds in kind. But in point of fact, Darius does not obviously identify the target of his preparation by his question. He might have thought that the relative clause, ephain stellatae, confined his question to the land to which he is intentionally going. But his wording cannot exclude the land to which he goes in actual fact. Nor, therefore, can the Pythia's response be understood so simply as an approval of his plan, as Idenau characterizes it. It is only by such elisions between the oracle and the meaning Darius took that the oracle has seemed to these scholars to have failed. In the histories, however, Herodotus reports the Sybarite version of the story, in which the oracle was actually fulfilled by Darius's receipt of Sybarite land, and there may be also a way to locate oracular fulfillment in the more cryptic oracular tale told by the Crotonians too, but that will have to be an argument for another time. These findings have implications for the use of modern studies in the sciences and social sciences by scholars and classics. These studies may seem to provide an objective viewpoint from which to observe and analyze the evidence of the ancient world. However, when it comes to objects of study that belong properly to emic subjective categories, such as what constitutes a prophetic sign, its correct interpretation, and its fulfillment, in adopting the Edic viewpoint, scholars merely exchange one subjectivity for another. What is needed, in my view, is not necessarily the abandonment of the assistance provided by other disciplines for the study of the ancient past, but a greater awareness of the potential for modern types of subjectivity to leak uninterrogated from other fields into our own, and a corresponding re-emphasis of importance in the study of the ancient perspective. To conclude, when social psychologists and classicists refer to prophetic failure, what they should mean is not the failure of a prophecy, but the disconfirmation of an expectation stemming from a literal and conventional interpretation of a prophecy. Drawing this distinction carefully allows us to maintain the validity of social psychological research into the cognitions and behaviors of believers in prophecy, and at the same time, to appreciate the place of prophecy in the thought worlds of believers. Thank you.